Commander Adrian Cross stood at the edge of the war room, his gaze fixed on the holographic projection of Zeltharion, the beating heart of the Zelvara Empire. The planet glowed with eerie blue light, its atmosphere thick with storm clouds that never parted. His officers watched him in tense silence, waiting for the command that would set the final battle into motion. "This is it," he said, voice steady. "We take the palace, end Veilzir, and break the Empire." The weight of his words filled the room. The war had dragged on for 5 brutal years, with humanity fighting against an empire that had ruled for centuries. The Zelvara were stronger, more advanced, and commanded forces unlike anything Earth had ever seen. But humans were adaptable, unpredictable, and relentless. Adrian turned to his second-in-command, Captain Darnell Hayes, a seasoned soldier whose face bore the scars of past battles. "Status on the fleet? All ships in position," Hayes confirmed. "Orbital bombardment is ready, but our intelligence confirms Veilzir has shields around the palace. We'll need boots on the ground." Adrian expected as much. The Zelvara didn't rely on conventional technology. Their empire was built on psionics, their rulers capable of bending minds and matter alike. A direct strike would never work against Veilzir. The plan was simple but deadly. His elite strike team would land in the capital, fight their way to the throne room, and end the war in one decisive strike. Victory would come at a cost, but humanity had already sacrificed too much to hesitate now. The command was given. The battle began. The descent through Zeltharion's storm-ridden atmosphere was violent, shaking Adrian's drop pod as if the planet itself resisted his presence. Outside, lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the alien city below, a sprawling maze of towering structures, each shimmering with ethereal blue light. The capital was unlike any world he had set foot on, its architecture both ancient and impossibly advanced. As the pod slammed into the ground, the hatch burst open. Adrian moved first, boots hitting the blackened stone. His strike team followed, weapons raised. The air hummed with unnatural energy, a pressure that clawed at his mind. The Zelvara were here. A dozen warriors emerged from the shadows, their movements impossibly graceful. Clad in armor that shimmered like liquid metal, they wielded weapons that crackled with psionic force. Their faces were smooth, statuesque, eyes glowing with an intensity that sent a chill down Adrian's spine. They attacked without warning. Adrian ducked as a blast of psionic energy tore past him, melting the stone where he had stood. He fired back, his plasma rifle singing through the air. His team moved in practiced formation, laying down suppressive fire as they advanced. The Zelvara fought with a precision that bordered on unnatural, their movements synchronized, their strikes calculated. One of them lunged at Adrian, a curved blade of pure energy forming in her hand. He barely deflected the strike with his combat knife, the force of the impact sending a tremor through his arm. She was faster, stronger, but he was used to fighting against the odds. He twisted, driving his knife upward into the gap between her armor plates. She staggered back, eyes wide, before collapsing. The battle raged on. More Zelvara fell, but so did his own. The throne room was still a mile away, and every step forward was paid for in blood. Then the ground trembled. The palace loomed ahead, a structure carved from obsidian and light, its entrance guarded by an imposing figure, twice the size of any warrior, clad in gilded armor that pulsed with raw energy. Veilzir stepped forward, the emperor of the Zelvara. Adrian felt the force of his presence like a physical blow. The air grew thick, his thoughts clouded. Veilzir raised a hand, and suddenly Adrian's body seized, his muscles locking in place. "You do not belong here." The voice wasn't spoken aloud. It echoed inside his skull, crushing, suffocating. Adrian gritted his teeth. He had fought too hard to stop now. With sheer force of will, he took a step forward. Then another. Veilzir's expression shifted, his amusement replaced by the slightest hint of surprise. "You resist." Adrian fired. The shot struck the Emperor's shield, shattering into fragments of light. Veilzir retaliated with a psionic blast that sent Adrian flying. Pain exploded through his ribs as he hit the stone, vision swimming. He forced himself up. He had fought through worse. Veilzir descended the palace steps, each movement controlled, deliberate. The emperor had ruled for centuries, a god among his people. He had never lost. Adrian intended to change that. Drawing his blade, he lunged. Steel met raw energy. Sparks flew as their weapons clashed, the force of each strike sending shockwaves through the air. Veilzir was stronger, but Adrian was faster. He dodged, weaving through attacks that could have torn him apart. Then he saw the opening. A split second. A single mistake. Adrian drove his blade into the emperor's chest. Veilzir gasped, eyes wide with disbelief. His body trembled as the psionic energy around him flickered, then collapsed. He staggered back, sinking to his knees. The impossible had happened. The emperor of the Zelvara was dead. The silence that followed was deafening. His team stood victorious, battered but alive. The remaining Zelvara warriors knelt, their weapons lowered. The war was over. Adrian pulled his blade free, stepping back. He expected celebration, the rush of victory. Instead, there was only the weight of what came next. Then the palace doors opened. A procession emerged, figures draped in flowing garments of white and gold. They moved with unearthly grace, their presence commanding. At their lead stood 4 women, their features unmistakably Zelvara, but their expressions unreadable. One of them, taller than the rest, stepped forward. Her silver eyes locked onto his, and when she spoke, her voice was like silk over steel. "The throne is yours, Earthborn, and by our laws so are we." Adrian frowned. "What?" She tilted her head, studying him. "You conquered our father. By tradition, you must wed his daughters." His mind reeled. He had expected resistance, retaliation, anything but this. Around him, his soldiers shifted uncomfortably. The Zelvara warriors remained silent, as if awaiting his answer. He glanced at the 4 women before him. Each one carried herself with the air of nobility, yet their expressions differed. Calculated, defiant, curious, unreadable. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Adrian exhaled, wiping blood from his brow. "I think we need to talk." The throne room of Zeltharion was nothing like Adrian had imagined. There were no banners of conquest, no symbols of war or oppression. Instead, towering crystalline pillars pulsed with soft, shifting light, casting an ethereal glow across the polished obsidian floor. The air thrummed with a strange energy, something ancient and unseen, yet undeniably present. It was not a palace of power, it was a sanctuary of control. And now it belonged to him. Adrian stood at the center, his stance rigid as the 4 daughters of Veilzir circled him like predators assessing prey. The words still echoed in his mind. "You must wed his daughters." The statement had landed heavier than the war itself. He had spent years fighting to overthrow the empire, only to find himself entangled in its traditions. Saris, the eldest, was the first to break the silence. Her silver eyes, colder than the void, settled on him with barely concealed disdain. "You hesitate, Earthborn. Do you find our ways strange?" Adrian exhaled slowly, keeping his temper in check. "Strange? No, but unexpected." Vaila, second-born, scoffed, arms crossed over her armored chest. Where Saris was composed, Vaila was all fire, her presence sharp, electric. "You think you have a choice?" she challenged. "You took the throne. That means you take responsibility. Or would you rather see this world burn?" He knew the answer before she even asked. The Zelvara were on the brink of collapse. Their empire, once unshakable, now teetered on the edge of chaos. Without leadership, there would be rebellion. Without order, the Zelvara might turn their rage outward, and humanity would not escape unscathed. Alicia, the youngest, watched him with quiet curiosity. She lacked the hardened arrogance of her sisters, but there was a sharpness in her gaze, a mind constantly analyzing. "You fear being bound to us," she mused. "You think it's a trap." He didn't answer. Finally, Nithra, the silent one, moved. She had barely spoken since their introduction, yet Adrian felt her presence more keenly than the others. She was different, unreadable. Her violet eyes seemed to peer into him, unraveling thoughts he hadn't yet formed. "You do not trust us," she said at last, voice barely above a whisper. "That is wise." Adrian ran a hand through his hair, exhaustion pressing in from all sides. "Trust isn't the issue. The issue is that I came here to end a war, not to play king." Saris tilted her head. "And yet here you are." The reality was inescapable. He was not a conqueror in the traditional sense. He had come to break the Empire's grip on the galaxy, to liberate those who had suffered under its rule. But in the process, he had become the very thing he sought to overthrow. And the Zelvara were watching. Reports streamed in from across the planet, nobles questioning his legitimacy, former generals plotting in the shadows. Many resented him, viewing him as an outsider, a usurper. Without swift action, the Empire would shatter, and the bloodshed would begin anew. The daughters knew it, too. Saris stepped closer, the soft glow of the throne room casting her in silver and shadow. "We are not asking for love, Earthborn. We are asking for stability." Vaila scoffed but did not disagree. Alicia studied him, waiting. Nithra said nothing at all. Adrian exhaled. He had fought battles in space, on land, against enemies with weapons far beyond human comprehension. And yet, nothing had prepared him for this. But the choice had already been made. "I'll do what's necessary," he said at last. "But I won't be your puppet." Saris smiled, but it wasn't warmth, it was approval. "Good." Outside the throne room, the city stirred. Zeltharion was still reeling from the fall of its emperor, and the streets were restless. The once perfect order of the Zelvara was fraying at the edges, the first cracks in an empire that had never known uncertainty. Adrian wasted no time. Within hours, he had assembled a war council, bringing together human officers and Zelvara military leaders who had pledged their loyalty, however reluctantly. The chamber was tense, filled with suspicion and barely restrained hostility. General Keln, an older Zelvara warrior with scars carved deep into his obsidian armor, eyed Adrian with disdain. "A human sits on our throne," he said, voice a slow venom. "And we are expected to accept this?" Adrian met his gaze without flinching. "No, you're expected to accept survival. Because without me, this empire falls. And when it falls, your people won't be the only ones bleeding." Keln's glare burned hotter, but he did not argue. The reality was clear. Without Adrian, the Zelvara had no unifying force. The nobles would tear each other apart in a bid for power, and their enemies would exploit the chaos. The only path forward was through him, but there were greater dangers lurking in the shadows. Reports had surfaced of a faction refusing to accept the emperor's death. Loyalists, hidden in the outer colonies, rallying under the banner of the Zelvara remnants. Their leader was unknown, but their intent was clear: restore the empire, no matter the cost. Worse still, Nithra had uncovered something chilling. She met Adrian in private, her violet eyes troubled in a way he had never seen before. "My father was prepared for his own death," she said, voice hushed. "He left something behind." Adrian frowned. "What?" She hesitated, as if the words themselves carried danger. "A weapon, one forged from psionic energy itself." His stomach tightened. "Where?" "A world long abandoned," she said. "A place forbidden even to us." He could feel the weight of the moment. This was not just a remnant of the past. This was the future, teetering on the edge of annihilation. If the remnants found the weapon first, there would be no stopping them. He had no choice. Gathering his most trusted soldiers, and, reluctantly, the 4 daughters, Adrian prepared to leave Zeltharion. His rule was still unsteady, his grasp on the empire fragile, but none of it would matter if the galaxy burned. As he stepped onto the waiting ship, Saris stood beside him, her expression unreadable. "This is a dangerous path," she said. Adrian glanced at her. "Is there any other kind?" The engines roared to life, and the stars stretched before them. The journey to the Forsaken World was silent. The warship carved through the void, its engines a low hum against the oppressive quiet that had settled over the crew. Adrian stood on the observation deck, staring out into the endless expanse of space. He had fought battles across entire star systems, led fleets through impossible odds, but something about this mission unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite define. Behind him, Saris approached, her presence as steady as ever. "You sense it too," she said, not a question but a certainty. Adrian turned to face her. "Something's wrong. This isn't just about an old weapon." Nithra had been the one to uncover the truth, yet even she had been reluctant to speak of it in detail. A world abandoned by the Zelvara, a secret locked away for generations. It was too convenient, too perfectly hidden. He had studied the Zelvara enough to know they did not abandon anything without reason. Vaila leaned against the bulkhead, arms crossed. "We should be prepared for anything. If the remnants are after this weapon, they already know more than we do." Alicia, seated at a nearby console, was already sifting through what little information they had on the planet. "We're entering orbit now," she reported. "No signs of life, no transmissions. It's as if the entire world is hollow." Adrian exchanged a look with Nithra. She had been quiet ever since they departed, her expression unreadable. "You still haven't told us everything," he said. She didn't deny it. Instead, she closed her eyes, inhaling deeply as if bracing herself. "Because I do not know if you're ready to hear it." The ship shuddered as it broke through the atmosphere, descending toward a planet that should not exist. The surface was unlike any world Adrian had ever seen. Blackened rock stretched endlessly beneath a sky that churned with unnatural energy. Jagged spires of obsidian jutted from the earth like skeletal remains of some ancient civilization. And at the heart of it all, a massive structure loomed, half buried in the remains of a long-dead city. The moment Adrian set foot on the ground, he felt it. A pulse, a whisper in the air that brushed against his mind like cold fingers. It was not a voice, not yet, but it was there, waiting. Saris tensed beside him. "This place is alive." Nithra stepped forward, her violet eyes dark with something almost like recognition. "No," she said. "It is awake." The team moved cautiously, weapons drawn as they approached the structure. The ruins bore no markings, no signs of life, yet the deeper they ventured, the more Adrian felt the pressure in his skull intensify. It wasn't just psionic energy, it was something older, deeper. Then they found the bodies. Zelvara soldiers, their armor shattered, their faces frozen in expressions of pure terror. They had not been killed by weapons. They had been drained, their very essence stripped away. Alicia knelt beside one of them, scanning the remains. "This isn't just death, it's consumption." Vaila's grip tightened on her rifle. "We need to move. Now." But it was already too late. The air trembled, the shadows shifted, and from the darkness they emerged. Figures humanoid yet wrong, their forms shifting like liquid obsidian. Eyes burned with cold, unfeeling light. They did not move, they glided, as if they were part of the air itself. The first attack came without warning. A wave of pure force sent Adrian and his team sprawling. He hit the ground hard, rolling into a crouch just in time to see one of the creatures reaching for him. He fired. The plasma bolt struck center mass and passed through, vanishing into the void of its body. "They're not real," Alicia gasped. "They're projections, psionic constructs." Saris didn't hesitate. She raised both hands, and the air around her shimmered with raw energy. A pulse erupted from her, shattering the nearest creature into nothingness. But more were coming. Adrian grabbed Nithra's arm. "Tell me what we're dealing with." She looked at him, and for the first time, there was fear in her eyes. "This is the reason my father feared death. The reason he never left this empire unguarded." He understood now. This was not a weapon. This was something far worse. The structure was not just a ruin. It was a prison, and something inside was waking up. The ground beneath them trembled. The shadows deepened, and from within the heart of the structure, a voice, ancient, unfathomable, spoke. Who dares trespass upon my tomb? The air turned to ice. The pressure on Adrian's mind became unbearable, a weight that pressed into his thoughts like a vice. Nithra was the first to answer. "We do not seek power," she said, voice steady despite the storm around them. "We seek understanding." Laughter. Cold, hollow laughter that rattled the very air. "You seek to chain the void, but the void cannot be chained." Adrian's instincts screamed at him to run, but he stood firm. "This empire is mine now," he said, forcing the words through the crushing weight of the presence. "Whatever you are, you have no place in it." Silence, then movement. From the depths of the structure, something stirred. A figure emerged, a being wreathed in shifting darkness, its form barely solid. Saris whispered, "No!" Nithra's voice was barely a breath. "Father!" Adrian's blood went cold. It was Veilzir, or what remained of him. The former emperor's body was twisted, consumed by the very power he had sought to control. His once proud form was now a thing of writhing darkness, his eyes no longer his own. "You cannot destroy me," the thing wearing Veilzir's face said. "I am eternal." Adrian tightened his grip on his weapon. "No, you're a mistake." And then all hell broke loose. The shadows erupted, tendrils of living void lashing out. Adrian dodged, barely avoiding the strike that shattered the ground where he had stood. His team scattered, firing into the mass of darkness even as it swallowed their attacks. Saris unleashed a psionic blast, carving through the creatures, but they reformed almost instantly. Alicia was chanting something in the old Zelvara tongue, her hands glowing with glyphs of energy. Vaila was pure motion, cutting down anything that came too close, though it was clear even she knew they were losing ground. Adrian knew they had only one option. "We need to collapse the structure," he ordered. "We can't let this thing escape." Nithra hesitated. "If we do that, we may never learn the truth." He met her gaze. "The truth doesn't matter if we're all dead." She swallowed hard, then nodded. Together they set the charges. The ground trembled, the shadows screaming in protest. Veilzir's form stretched, warping into something monstrous, his voice turning into a chorus of whispers. "This is not the end." Adrian pressed the detonator. The world shattered. The team barely made it back to the ship as the ruins collapsed in on themselves, sealing whatever horror had lurked beneath. As they ascended into orbit, the planet itself seemed to sigh, its skies finally still. No one spoke for a long time. Then Alicia broke the silence. "That wasn't just a weapon. That was something else." Saris exhaled. "That was a warning." Adrian stared out the viewport, his mind still reeling. The war had ended, but something far worse had just begun.